everyone. Welcome to Psych 101. I'm so excited to get into this material with you today. I am starting with Module 1, Introduction to Psychology. I'm going to have a comprehensive overview, just kind of going and exploring the science of mind and behavior. So, psychology as a science, studies the mental processes and behavior using empirical evidence to understand human experience. We can do this in a couple different ways. We have the empirical studies, so all the works that are published and they've taken their time to go through the IRB and collect this data in a very organized and clinical setting. But it also can be more of a relaxed setting depending on the type of study. Then you have your mental processes that are also part of psychology because all those thoughts, memories, and emotions are ever present in our daily lives. And so it's important to understand where those thoughts and feelings come from. Um, then you have your observable behaviors. So anything from watching somebody walk their dog across the street to you having your own actions that you can observe within yourself. So all those actions that can be seen and measured is part of psychology. And then, of course, ethics. Ethics is really a big thing that we didn't have when we first started off as a field. And it led to a lot of horrific and life-altering studies that gave us a lot of knowledge, but had we done them in today's society, I can't see that going as far as it did in a lot of cases, like taking the Stanford prison experiment, for example, even the white little Albert study with the rat, that is also kind of, you would say, teetering on the ethical fence line. So your objective when it comes to psychology is being able to describe, explain, predict, and influence behavior. And we use the scientific method because we are a science. And yeah, the whole purpose of learning about psychology in general is to just build knowledge that improves your life and the lives of those around you. And so I chose this quote: "The science of psychology studies the mind and behavior across human life." So yeah. Here's some biological foundations of behavior. So, how does the physical body drive our thoughts and actions? Well, biological psychology explores the deep connection between our brain, genes, and behavior. So, we have a couple different reasons as to why we do what we do. We have a bunch of neural communication. So, all the neurons that are we have a lot of neural communication. So all of the neurons we have a lot of neural communication. So we have neurons that send impulses and chemical signals across synapses to process information. So, for example, whenever you go to touch a hot stove and it's hot, your hand immediately pulls away. That's because you have neurons that are telling your brain that what you are feeling is hot and you need to move it to protect your skin. Um, then you have your neurotransmitters. So think about all your emotions and how they come about. You have the chemical messengers. So you have dopamine, serotonin, and they have a direct influence on your mood, memory, and motivation. So think about playing your favorite game, for example. Your favorite game is definitely going to have a lot of points in which dopamine is ever present. You know, all the different alarms and bells and awards that are in the system of the game itself are intentionally designed for you to constantly feel a sense of achievement. So that sense of achievement is dopamine running through your brain and giving you that motivation to continue and a memory that this game is making you feel good. And of course, when you think, oh, I remember this makes me feel good, it also influences your mood. So then you have your brain specializations. So different parts of the brain are responsible for different parts of our behavior, so or different parts of just how we function. So for example, you have your different regions of the brain, like your lobes, that handle specific tasks from vision to reasoning. So, for example, the occipital lobe is for processing visual input. And additionally, our genetics also play a large role in how we end up uh, growing up and evolving as human beings. As to say, the saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, is quite, um, it's not a saying for no reason. So, our genetics and evolution, our genetic makeup and evolutionary history shape our predispositions and behavioral patterns. So you can have inherited traits even if you've never met these people in your life, and they can have an influence on your personality, temperament, and just how your learning might need to be directed in a certain way. So, sensation and perception. How do we detect the world, detect and interpret the world? It is a complex process of converting physical energy into mental experiences. So, of course, you have your sensation, which is your raw physical energy. So, the light, the sound from the environment, your body is just absorbing that and taking it in. Perception, so it just comes to you, you're dealing with it. Then now you have to process it. So you have perception. And that's your brain's way of kind of organizing and interpreting all this data that it's collected into something meaningful. So, originally you just look at a sunset, and until your brain tells you to perceive it a certain way, all you're doing is looking at a sunset. So then, of course, you not only have perception, but then you have transduction, which is conversion of one form of energy. So taking that light, and now the brain has not only perceived it, but is now kind of translating it for the brain. And then over time, that you experience these things, of course, the first take birth, for example. If I were to do an example with this as talking about birth, your sensation would be exiting the womb. All that light, sound from the doctors, you have no idea what's going on. Your perception, well, you don't have much to go off of. So all you know is that you are looking for something that is familiar. That's usually why they encourage the resting of the child on the mother right after birth to kind of relax the nervous system of the infant. Well, then, after they've kind of perceived the situation, their brain has to tell them what to do. And usually the nurses are and the doctors are stimulating the baby. So that's that's another example of sensation. And they're stimulating the baby, and by that stimulation, the brain is then alerting itself that it needs to evacuate all of the amniotic fluid from all the crevices in which are supposed to intake oxygen. And so without those three things, without the sensation, the brain organizing it into this is life-saving, and then that transduction, which is actually allowing the brain to activate the other parts of the body, then we don't have the full picture. And so I really like that this diagram shows the dominance of vision, because that is our most um It is our biggest experience, I think, because as far as hearing, yes, touch, smell, taste, but as we see way more than we do any of the other four senses. So then over time, you have sensory adaptation. Of course, nothing is going to be as startling as being an infant being birthed into this world. But of course, any new situation can still lead to sensitivity. And additionally, to simplify, you're diminishing sensitivity to an unchanging stimulus. And this allows us to gather more information. So, for example, whenever you watch a movie, the first time you might see something, and then the second time you watch the movie, you might notice something else. And that's because your brain has already perceived it, understood what that meant, and now you're able to see the movie from a different perspective. So, let's go into the states of consciousness. So, the subjective experience. What is consciousness? And that is definitely going to be one of our discussion topics. But honestly, all of these could be good discussion topics. You could just tell me something about what you enjoyed about the program or the first lecture, and it really could just be anything. So, some examples of states of consciousness. You have your full alertness. So that's going to be any of your focused attention on completing a task. So anything that you've just put your full effort into, that is full alertness. Daydreaming, so that's going to be your spontaneous shifts in attention to internal thoughts. So if you were just sitting at your desk and just like staring at a wall, you're probably daydreaming. I think we all know about sleep and the lack of it. But um, sleep, a natural periodic loss of consciousness. I just think that that is such a nice, broad way of explaining sleep because I mean, it is a loss of consciousness, but it is also a way for our brain to kind of just recharge from the day. Then you have your altered states that are induced by medication, hypnosis, or drugs. So it's important to understand awareness because as they say, as William Jennings said, consciousness flows like a stream. Additionally, you have controlled versus automatic processing. So there's a lot of things like breathing, for example. You don't right off the bat, or you know how to breathe right off the bat, should I say. But you can also manually breathe if you start to think about it. Then you think of your circadian rhythm, so your biological clock, which for most people, or at least for me in particular, mine seems to be all kinds of skewed. And then you have your sleep stages, your REM and your non-REM cycles. So here's a nice little chart kind of explaining consciousness. You have the state, which is waking, which is going to be your high awareness and your probably your best response to stimuli around you. Then you have sleep, which is low awareness, but it's important for physical restoration. And then you have a meditative state, which is your focused awareness and reduced stress, just a place we would all like to be. So, learning, conditioning, and beyond. So, how do we acquire new behaviors and knowledge? Learning is a relatively permanent change of behavior due to experience occurring through several primary mechanisms. So, we have quite a few different ways in which we learn. You have classical conditioning, so think learning through association of stimuli where a neutral stimulus begins to trigger a response. So I always use the example of Pavlov and his dogs. The dog started to salivate at the sound of a bell when it was paired with food. Then you have operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is learned through consequences where behaviors are strengthened by rewards or weakened by punishments. So, a good example of this is a dog sitting to receive a treat, and that was with Skinner. He also liked to train pigeons. At one point, he had trained pigeons to launch or guide missiles, but it's all about teaching them through his operant conditioning. Then you have observational learning, so watching and imitating behaviors of others, which a lot of us do without realizing that we are observational learners. But a good example is by Bandura, so a child learning to tie their shoes by watching their parent tie their shoes. And then you have cognitive learning, the mental processing of information, including problem solving and insight. So, over time, like you might not understand how to solve a puzzle, but then you look back over it after thinking about it, maybe resting on it, and then you realize that you actually understand the solution to the puzzle. That's actually in a lot of fields, they recommend that you take a step away from whatever you're doing and come back to it at a later time because it gives your brain a chance to process the information that you may have just learned, depending on how novel you are to the task at hand. And so it's just a really good way for your brain to just essentially kind of load like internet dial up, but overall just works really, really well when you take your time. So, memory and cognition. Memory is the mental system for receiving, encoding, storing, and retrieving information, and it allows us to learn from the past and plan for the future. So, if you think about encoding, I always think about like encoding on a computer, but if you think about it in your brain, it's converting that information, so that raw data, that light, that sound, um, whatever it is, and understanding that this is they're teaching me my planets right now. I should probably store that information, especially if you have like a test coming up or whatever. Um, and then you have your storage, your brain. I believe a lot of it comes from the hippocampus. At least that's for memories. But there's different parts in which we store um in the brain, how we store our memories, and the various systems within them. And then you have your retrieval. So that's kind of going into your brain, pulling that memory that you need to the front of it or out your mouth, and then being able to kind of just put it back. Kind of thinking of like a nice organizational system, like you pull out your Christmas lights for the holiday, but then you realize that you'll probably need them at a later time, so you might need to store them up nicely. And so that's our nice little storage and retrieval system that allows us to know the things we know. And then we have three different types of memories. Um, one of my favorite, this is a side note, but one of my favorite books that really talks on memory, and I had to read it in my undergrad, is Moonwalking with Einstein. And I definitely recommend it to anyone. They have, I think, the audiobooks on YouTube, but it is just such a great book. To start with the first one, we have sensory memory, which is a brief storage of raw sensory input. Think icons and echoes. We have our working memory, so that's an active processing unit of current information, and we can usually handle like 7 items, give or take 2 at a time. So that in our working memory, we can usually remember anywhere from 5 to 9 things. And then we have our long-term memory, which is permanent storehouse for skills and knowledge. And a great quote by Cicero and Oscar Wilde is memory is the treasury and guardian of all things. It is the diary that we all carry about with us. So I think that's just a lovely way to understand memory, because I think a lot of the times memory has such a negative connotation, and or it can, and I don't feel as though we need to shame ourselves or shame our past, because there's just so much that we've learned from it, and can continue to learn from it, which is the whole reason why you want to study psychology and mental health in general. So, moving on to intelligence and language. How do we process information and communicate complex ideas? Intelligence and language are the twin pillars of human cognitive superiority. So, we have theories of intelligence. So, from Spearman's general factor to Garden multiple intelligence. So, social, musical, uh, good example is having high emotional intelligence, so your EQ. There's a bunch of theories on intelligence. Then you can measure your intelligence. So you have standardized tests like the WISE measure and various other cognitive tests to determine the IQ. So, for example, using a Raven matrices test for fluid intelligence. And then you have your language structure. Of course, we aren't able to communicate much without language. Of course, there are other ways to functionally communicate, but in regards to speaking about language, it's built from phonemes, sounds, morphemes, the meaning of the sounds, and then the syntax, which is the rules of how all of it sounds and formulates. And then over time, of course, we've been having our language development. It develops from not only from birth, but over time, we've been able to kind of formulate our language into more organized manners. But humans have an innate capacity for language, moving from babbling to complex sentences. So just if you think about an infant at some point as they grow up, they're going to hit a babbling stage. They're going to be like, ba, 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 da, 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 da. And that is a way for them to develop their language. And that's a time that the parents would usually intervene and talk to them and kind of shape that language as they start to speak, which is a way to reinforce functional communication and verbal behavior. So, moving on to motivation, emotion, and health. What drives our behaviors and feelings? The interplay between biological needs, psychological states, and social factors determines our overall health. So we have our motivation, the internal processes that initiate, guide, and maintain goal-oriented behaviors. So our drives versus our incentives. Then we have the emotion, which is complex physiological states involving subjective experience, physiological arousal, and expressive behavior. Our stress and health, how we perceive and respond to challenges, and its direct impact on our physical and mental well being. And then, of course, our well being, which is the cultivation of positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, which all go into a nice acronym, PERMA. And then I have this nice diagram here that kind of go through the different stages of development. So you can take a moment and look at that. And we'll go more into early development in other lectures, but this is just kind of a brief introduction as Psycho 101 is just an overview of all the concepts that will eventually be talked about more in depth. So our lifespan development and our journey of growth. So what is development? Development is a lifelong process of physical, cognitive, and social change that begins at conception and continues until death. We have quite a few developmental milestones, and within each of these subsequent milestones, we have even smaller milestones that are usually especially talked about in infancy. But to go brief overview, in infancy, you are developing trust and motor skills. You think fine motor, gross motor, learning how to talk. In adolescence, you are forming your identity and um, abstract reasoning. So that's when you start to your opinions usually start to differ from that of your parental figure. And then in adulthood, you start to take on a career, maybe have a life partner, and just kind of in general, you're just kind of figuring it out, as we all do. And then in late adulthood, there's reflection and integrity. So after all you've lived through all the other developmental milestones, you kind of reflecting on your life, maybe sitting on your porch drinking a sweet tea or whatever you do. Yeah, when you have late adulthood. So some keys to understanding growth, you have the nature versus nurture debate. So the whole debate behind nature versus nurture is that nature, we innately understand things like, for example, a baby learning to breastfeed. It's a skill that they biologically have, and they do know how to breastfeed, but sometimes you do have to nurture and train that skill. So that's a good way of using the two together. But nature is more on the aspect that the environment will teach your kids, and nurture is on the thing is that you need to teach them and not just rely on nature. And so it's a big debate. It's kind of people go either way on it. I think that you can't have nature without nurture, and it will exist, but the quality of life is substantially lower than when you have the two together. Then you have continuity versus stages. So continuity, of course, is going to be the same thing over and over again, whereas stages is going to be abrupt changes in your life that maybe weren't planned, maybe they were planned. And then that kind of goes into your critical periods. So when you're in times of high stress or times of just unfortunate circumstance, these are optimal times from learning, which is why a lot of, I think all Buddhist practices say that pain is growth, and I couldn't agree more on that one. As far as social development, over time, your social attachments and relationships begin to grow or diminish depending on your um, the way you interact with others. And so I think that's a lot of the times why whenever I used to work ABA, we would prioritize social skills because it's so isolating for those adolescents to be so castigated from their neurotypical friend group because they don't really understand how to nurture a friendship. So that's another good example of nurture. And so here's the couple different stages, a little bit more. Well, I kind of just went over the same thing back to back. But you have in childhood your skill acquisition, your play, your learning, in adolescence, your identity and social acceptance, and in adulthood, your contributions to society, your family, and reflecting on all the things you've accomplished in your life or haven't, depending on where your life is going. So, some key questions in social psychology is how do others influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors? Well, social psychology examines the power of the situation and connects our connections to others. And so, as through quite a few different things like social influence, and a great example of this is on the Milgram study on obedience to authority, in which um, the participants were commanded or expected to deliver a seemingly uh, deadly voltage to the participants that they were working with. And because a lot of them did end up delivering this deadly shock. And when they were asked why, it was because they were told by the doctor. And so you have that social influence being conformed by others, other professionals, maybe your best friend. So your social influence. Then you have your social cognition, and so it's how we perceive, remember, and interpret information about ourselves and others. If you think about the fundamental attribution error, um, I also like to think of like learned helplessness, because whenever we see a bunch of people on the side of if we see an emergency on the side of the road, sometimes we assume that somebody else is going to get to that. And that is a learned helplessness because in that case, nobody is attending to the situation and can be quite dangerous. And then your group dynamics. So processes that occur within and between groups, such as cooperation and conflict. So thinking of social facilitation, like so if you think of like organized school programs like Skool, or how you have a group of friends and you just hang out. So yeah. Then your pro-social behavior. So actions that are intended to benefit others, um, such as altruism and helping behavior. So obviously, we're not just a bunch of people on this planet that hate other people. And so a lot of the times we get together as groups and we can benefit others by helping at our like local community, by helping at our local community banks or just volunteering at a nursing home. There's just a lot of things that we can do to spread that positivity towards others, and we definitely need to be more responsible for our impact because I think a lot of times our impact is negative. So I realized that I caught myself. There was an error that I said earlier. I said learned helplessness, and I meant the bystander, not learned helplessness. Although learned helplessness is a form of not tending to a current issue, the bystander effect is going to be for the example of somebody needing assistance and everybody walking past them thinking that the other person is going to assist. So I just wanted to clarify that. All right. So personality and psychological disorders. So how do we understand individual differences and mental health challenges? Well, through clinical psychology, we integrate trait theories with evidence-based treatment. So you have your personality traits. Think of the big five. Comes from the ocean model. You have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. There are psychological disorders, persistent stressing patterns of behavior, thoughts, or emotions. So thinking about anxiety, any kind of um, mood disorders, or schizophrenia. Then you have psychological therapies. So if you think of evidence-based talk therapy like CBT, and then there's other psychodynamic therapies like PBT, DBT, ABA. Well, ABA is not a psychological therapy, it's more of a behavior therapy, but there are different ways in which we can not only talk about and understand our personality, but also understand any of the mental disorders that can arise. And then there's different biomedical treatments for these things, like medication, so using SSRIs, or there's even different treatments that are still on more experimental note, but have a lot of good out results, and I think are being fast forwarded to a more concrete study. So brain stimulation, like light therapy and things like that to manage symptoms by altering our brain chemistry and putting that memory into a different spot in our brain that maybe we can't access as easily, or even kind of doing like a Neo thing or the Men in Black and erasing your memory. And so yeah, that was the first lecture of Psych 101, and I hope you enjoy. There will be more to come. We'll be going into Foundations next chapter, but I hope to see everybody at the live discussion, and I'm really excited for this venture. So, thank you.